Senator. Hey, thank you for joining us. I want to get right into something. It's near and dear to our heart, Eventbrite. Eventbrite was squelching our friend Riley Gage. You stepped in, OutKick stepped in, and we got Eventbrite to turn that around. Give me your thoughts on that fiasco.
Well, look, it's a manifestation of what we're seeing across big tech and across institutions in our country, which is they've gone woke. And when it comes to big tech, they use their power for censorship. They use their power against views that are disfavored. And I think what they were doing to Riley Gaines was disgraceful. I was glad to speak out against it. I was very glad OutKick spoke out against it. And that incident embodies, as you know, I've got a brand new book that just came out this past week, and it's called Unwoke: How to Defeat Cultural Marxism in America. And it is exactly about what you just asked about. It is about how every major institution in America has been taken over by the radical left, and it explains it. And each chapter is on a different institution. So it starts with universities. I call universities the Wuhan lab of the woke virus. It's where it was created, it's where it mutated, it's where it spread. And then from universities, it goes to K through 12 education. It goes to journalism, it goes to government, it goes to big business, it goes to big tech, it goes to entertainment, Hollywood, movies, TV, sports, and music. From there, it goes to science. And the last chapter is on China, which is a central nexus connecting it all. And what this book does is explains, number one, how the radical left took over each of these institutions. But number two, even more importantly, it lays out a clear practical step for how we fight back and how we take the institutions back. And this is a great example where you guys and I and others called them out. One of the steps, one of the tools we have is sunshine and transparency, because their views are wildly unpopular. Normal, rational people don't support grown men going into women's locker rooms and showering, schools forcing women to shower next to grown men. That doesn't make any sense. And it's the radical left's agenda nonetheless.
How do sports fight back? You mentioned the transgender issue, which has made people absolutely insane, but we see it everywhere. We see it in the NBA. Hell, hockey, everybody got mad because they didn't wear gay pride sweaters. How does the average person fight back?
Yeah. So there are lots of tools we can use, but I really advocate three different tools. One is transparency and sunlight, because the left's agenda is wildly unpopular. The second is increasing the negative costs, the harms that people face from going woke. And the third is for conservative business leaders and libertarian business leaders to invest in the organs of transmission of ideas. Buy a radio station, buy a TV station, buy a movie studio, buy a record label, buy a book publishing house. Actually, OutKick, you are part of how we fight back, creating alternative avenues to communicate. What you guys are doing is integral to the strategy of how we retake those institutions. You look at the NBA, which was happy to put Black Lives Matter emblazoned on the courts for an entire season. Well, you know what happened? Their viewership and their customers and ticket buyers plummeted, and they lost a ton of money. And you notice they very quietly just scraped it right off the court. That's part of how you hold them accountable. You increase the negative consequences. You change the cost-benefit ledger. And we're seeing victories like that over and over again. And what I advocate in the book on woke is systematically fighting in each institution to do exactly that.
You know, speaking of China, I just saw this and I'm stunned. San Francisco somehow, some way got its street cleaned in about 10 minutes. Now the communist dictator is coming in limousines, and we've got the streets of San Francisco lined with Chinese flag. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the country and the dude that put COVID into our lives in the United States. Am I going too far with that description?
You are not at all. You are absolutely right. And that, again, is a major theme of my book on woke. The reason the final chapter is on China is because China is intertwined with every one of these institutions. And there's a reason Joe Biden is there kissing the ring of Xi. I explain in this book how today's Democrat Party, tragically, is structurally pro-China. And the reason they're pro-China is their major stakeholders, big business, big tech, big universities, and big Hollywood, are all in bed with China. And so Joe Biden's there saying, we don't want to decouple from China. Well, you know what, Joe? Yes, we do. And we saw in the middle of COVID, number one, and I lay out in the book, in my chapter on science, the evidence that the COVID virus what escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a Chinese government lab. I think the weight of the evidence suggests that China created the virus through gain-of-function research. Then they suppressed it, suppressed the news when it escaped. They are directly responsible for the millions of deaths that came from COVID, for the trillions in economic loss. And Joe Biden and the Democrats won't hold them accountable. And even worse, they won't stand up to them. They won't de-link our economy. During COVID, we saw a Chinese state-owned newspaper threatening to cut off life-saving pharmaceuticals, medicines, heart medicines, blood pressure medicines, cancer medicines that Americans need to stay alive as a tool of economic warfare. We cannot remain dependent on China. We've got to stand up to them. But, you know, the trip to San Francisco also embodies the massive hypocrisy of the left. Listen, San Francisco is a great American city, an iconic American city that has been utterly destroyed by radical left-wing politics. And the fact that 3 days ago they couldn't clean the streets, that the residents were told, I'm sorry, there have to be criminals everywhere on the street, there have to be homeless people, there have to be people shooting up drugs on the street, there have to be people defecating on the street. They literally have an app they sell in San Francisco that is called Poop Finder, where you can report human feces on the sidewalk. And yet when the head of the Chinese Communist Party comes, they miraculously clean it all. They remove the criminals. They remove the homeless people. Well, why the hell didn't they do that a week ago? Do the residents of San Francisco not count, or does the left only work for the Chinese communists?
Is it overblown, the crime that's going on across the country, including in D.C., where we're seeing carjackings, including, well, I guess the president's granddaughter? Do you think, I get it told all the time, well, that's overblown. That's overblown. Okay, well, in your view, is it?
It's not remotely overblown. One of the things we've seen over the last 3 years is crime rates skyrocketing across the country, murder rates skyrocketing, carjacking rates skyrocketing, assault rates skyrocketing. Look, in D.C., you're right. Someone tried to break into the car of the president's granddaughter. The Secret Service had to fire rounds. By the way, if that were just an ordinary citizen, if that were you firing rounds, you'd be in jail. But if it's the detail protecting the president's granddaughter, it's okay. We also had a member of Congress. We had a member of Congress, Henry Cuellar, carjacked in D.C. at 9 o'clock at night. He was at his apartment building. His apartment building filled with members of Congress, and yet they carjacked him. They stole his car. They stole his luggage at gunpoint. And the reason we're seeing this rise in crime is very simple. There are radical leftists, and we talk about this again in the book Unwoke. I talk about this at great length. Is we have policies that George Soros DAs and liberal elected officials are letting violent criminals go. The District of Columbia City Council voted to lessen the penalties for murder, to lessen the penalties for carjacking. You look at New York, Lee Zeldin, who ran for governor of New York, and he was running on a tough on crime platform. Now, tragically, he did not win, but in the middle of that campaign, someone literally physically and violently assaulted him, jumped on the stage with a sharpened keychain and tried to slit his throat. That guy was arrested and released within hours on a cashless bail. So even someone who is trying to murder a candidate for governor of New York, they don't keep that attempted murderer in jail even one day. When you release criminals from jail, you get more crime. And you know, Dan, the point is, normal people get that. Ordinary people get that.
Right.
And it's one of the real points of the book is the left, they only advance this wildly unpopular agenda through force and power or through indoctrination, which is why if we focus on it, if we highlight it, if we stand up and fight it, we can take these institutions back.
Conversation is really important. I watched your interview, your appearance with Bill Maher, and you know what? Yeah. Bill Maher apologized to you, and it seemed like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed like you were having a great time with him. Now, who would have thunk this? But isn't it amazing when people let go of political ideology and just have a discussion, common sense and logic seems to seep through?
Yeah, look, amen. I had a blast on the show with Bill Maher. I've watched it for a long time. First time I've ever been on the show. But look, I respect Bill Maher. He's an old school liberal, so he and I disagree on a lot of issues. But he believes in things like free speech, and he actually has the courage to stand up and defend them. And the point you just made is something I told Bill on a show just this past weekend. I said, listen, you have on this show, you have people from the left and right, and they talk to each other. And that happens almost nowhere in the media space. One of the real problems we have in America is we live in separate universes. The right listens to right-wing media. The left listens to left-wing media. We don't talk to each other, and we live, the worlds are so different. If someone disagrees with you with social media, you unfriend them, and everyone is in an echo chamber. And I believe if our country is going to survive, we got to talk to each other. I try to spend a lot of time going and talking to people who disagree with me. So I do a podcast every week. It's called Verdict with Ted Cruz. We do it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We've gone and done campus tours. We've gone to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. We went to Yale University. I actually talk about the Yale podcast in the book Unwoke, where we had 700 Yale students come out for the Verdict podcast on campus. And I would say about a third of them were left of center. And I know that because it was right after Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. And when I said that, about a third of the room erupted in applause. And I said, listen, from your applause, we're obviously coming from a different place in the political spectrum. I wanted to say to those of you left of center especially, thank you for being here. We've got to talk to each other. And the way we do the podcast on campus, we do about 90 minutes of Q&A, and it's all live. And we have a rule, if you have a hostile or antagonistic question, come to the front of the line. And we had a robust conversation. I'll tell you, Dan, afterwards, I went out and got drinks with a rabbi who works on campus. And he told me, he said, Ted, this was the biggest group of Yale students I've seen have a cordial, respectful, civil conversation on conservative ideas, he said, in 20 years. I think there's a hunger for it, and we need to talk to each other.
I think there's a real hunger for it. I think one of the problems, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, relative to universities, there's no consequence for disrespect. There's no consequence for antagonism. There's no consequence for somebody showing up at something like your deal and being a jackass, throwing paint or whatever. There's no consequence. I think consequence is important. Conversation, massively important, but you just can't have people acting like idiots, ruining it for people that want to have conversation without consequence.
You are absolutely right, and I'll give you bad news and good news. The bad news is what we're seeing on college campuses right now, the rabid anti-Semitism that is outpouring on college campuses. 35 student groups at Harvard signed a letter saying that all of the violence, all of the atrocities committed by Hamas terrorists, the civilians murdered, the women and children raped, the infants slaughtered, they said all of that is 100% the fault of Israel. That is ignorant, it is racist, it is anti-Semitic, and it is a manifestation of the cultural Marxists that have seized that institution. Just down the river at MIT, this week we have reports of Jewish students being violently and physically prevented from going to class by angry, threatening anti-Israel protesters, and Jewish students saying they don't feel safe on campus at MIT. And absurdly, the administration at MIT says they won't expel the students who are violently threatening other students and stopping them from going to class. Why? Because they're foreigners there on student visas, and if they expel them, they'll lose their student visa. Well, if you're a guest in this country, you should abide by our laws, and if you're violently threatening other students, you should be sent back to your home country. Look, that's a sign of just how sick these institutions are. Now, let me give you a positive sign on the other side, and this is a story I tell in the book Unwoke. You remember last year, when a federal appellate judge went to Stanford Law School and he was giving a speech at Stanford Law School, and angry protesters began screaming, began yelling, began threatening him, began screaming that his children should be raped. Well, when that happened, it was disgraceful. They stopped his speech. They shut down his speech. A dean came from the law school. The DEI dean came, and the judge thought that she would enforce Stanford's free speech policy. She didn't. She sided with the angry mob, and the line she kept saying is the juice worth the squeeze? It's painful to listen to you. Well, here's the good news. When that happened, number one, I wrote to the president of Stanford and then the dean of Stanford Law School calling for there to be consequences, what you just said, and they fired the DEI dean in response to that. Number two, I wrote to the Texas State Bar, and I said, look, to be a member of the bar, you have to pass a character and fitness exam. If you tried to do what those law students did in a courtroom, if you're a lawyer and you scream and yell at a judge, you will be held in contempt, you will be arrested and sent to jail. As a lawyer, you can't treat a judge that way. And I urge the Texas State Bar to engage in additional examination whether applicants from Stanford Law School engaged in that kind of violence. Well, you know what? The Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court wrote me back and said the Texas State Bar agrees. And now for graduates of Stanford and also Yale Law School, where they've had similar incidents, they're going to do additional examination into whether they've ever participated in harassing or threatening speakers. All of this is an example of increasing the negative consequences, and it's how we push back and start to take these institutions back.
Well, logic says you do, and that's great news. Last thing, if both win out and Alabama goes into the college football playoff ahead of Texas, will there be a Senate inquiry? Will people have to appear before you?
Look, I'm just saying this. My view is simple, which is hook 'em horns. It ought to be simple and straightforward. Texas is having an awesome season. I'm still mourning our one loss to Oklahoma. It was tragic. It was heartbreaking. Actually, ironically, the day Texas lost to Oklahoma, I was at A&M at the A&M Alabama game, which was another heartbreaking loss. And I will say, sadly, Kyle Field, I think, erupted in louder cheers that Texas lost than they did for an Aggie touchdown. And so I refrained from those particular cheers. I root for every Texas team, but I'm proud of the Longhorns this year. They're having a heck of a season.
Yeah, they're having a great year. Hey, I know you've got to run. I love talking to you. Second time you've been on. Thank you, sir. Great stuff.
Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. I just want to say to all your viewers, this book, it's not an abstract academic book. It's filled with stories. It's fun. It's interesting, and it's available in any bookstore. It's available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Books A Million. I would encourage you, buy one because you'll enjoy reading it, but also Christmas is right around the corner. This makes a great gift. Buy a book for your mom. Buy it for your best friend, or even better, buy it for your kids because they need to know the garbage that the radical left is trying to indoctrinate them with. It's a great read, and it is useful. It gives you real tools to fight back against the lunacy we're seeing right now.
I'm going to get it to one of my family members as an educational educational tool so that she can come out of the darkness of wokeness. How about that?
Fantastic. Excellent. That's exactly what it's designed for.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dan.
I really appreciate it. I've kept you too long. Thank you. That's Senator Ted Cruz. I love having that man on my show. I think he should be president of the United States.